I'm not taking care of that old witch, my daughter-in-law whispered beside my son's casket, loud enough for 3 rows of mourners to hear. And in that moment, with white lilies crowding the chapel and the smell of polished wood hanging in the air, I realized this funeral was not only about saying goodbye to Daniel, it was also the beginning of a quiet war. I did not turn around. I did not gasp. I did not give Brittany the satisfaction of seeing my face crumble in front of her friends, the pastor, or the neighbors who had watched my boy grow from a lanky little league pitcher into a man with tired eyes and a generous heart. I simply kept my gloved hand on the edge of the pew and stared at the silver handles of the casket, willing myself to breathe evenly while the organ hummed low through the room. My son was 41 years old. 41, a number that felt too young to belong on a prayer card. Just 10 days earlier, I had still been setting aside a container of chicken soup to bring to the hospital, still believing there would be another week, another phone call, another chance to hear him say, "Morning, Mom," in that warm voice that always sounded a little rushed and a little apologetic. But now there was only silence, flowers, and Brittany in a fitted black dress, accepting condolences as if grief were something she could arrange as neatly as the catered trays waiting in the fellowship hall. I had spent the entire morning telling myself I was there for Daniel and Daniel alone. I had repeated it while fastening the pearl earrings he bought me for my 65th birthday. I had repeated it in the car while the February rain tapped softly against the windshield. I had repeated it while stepping into the funeral home under a gray sky that made the whole world look drained of color. Then I heard her say it, and all those small, uneasy moments from the past week came rushing back with a sharpness that made my stomach tighten. Brittany had been controlling everything since Daniel passed. She picked the funeral home. She changed the visitation hours. She told me which photos were appropriate for the memory table and which ones made Daniel look too young. She smiled when she said it, too, with that smooth, polished smile that never quite reached her eyes. Twice at the hospital, I had arrived only to be told Daniel was sleeping and shouldn't be disturbed, though one nurse had looked at me strangely, as if she knew that message had not come from him. Once, when I called his phone late in the evening, Brittany answered and said, "He needs rest, Margaret. Try not to make this harder than it already is." I remember standing in my kitchen after that call, one hand still on the counter, staring at the yellow light over the stove and wondering when exactly I had become an intrusion in my own son's life. At the time, I blamed stress, grief, exhaustion. I told myself people said unfortunate things when life turned cruel. But in the chapel, hearing her reduce me to that ugly word while Daniel lay a few feet away, I understood something colder. This was not stress. This was not a slip. This was relief. Relief that he was gone. Relief that I was alone. Relief that whatever had stood between Brittany and the future she wanted had just been buried in a navy suit beneath a spray of white roses. The minister began to speak, but his voice drifted in and out around me like radio static. I noticed details instead. Chloe, my granddaughter, sitting stiffly across the aisle, her mascara smudged despite all her effort to look composed. Martin Hale, Daniel's attorney, arriving late and taking a seat near the back with a folder tucked under one arm. Brittany leaning toward a cousin I barely knew, her mouth moving in a tight little line between sympathy and calculation. And me, Margaret Whitmore, 68 years old, wearing sensible black pumps and a coat Daniel once teased me for keeping far too long, sitting upright in the front row while something inside me shifted. Not shattered. Shifted. There is a difference. Shattering is loud. This was silent. Precise. Like a lock turning. I kept my eyes on the casket and let Brittany think I had heard nothing. Let her think I was too heartbroken to notice the glances, the whispers, the way she kept checking her phone in between hugs. Let her think I would leave this place broken and grateful for whatever scraps of decency she chose to offer. I had spent years being careful, being polite, being the kind of mother who never wanted to make trouble for her son. But as the minister said Daniel's name and the chapel fell into that deep aching hush that belongs only to funerals, I made a promise to myself. I would not make a scene. I would not beg. And before this was over, I would learn exactly why my daughter-in-law had already decided I was a burden she refused to carry. The receiving line blurred past me in a procession of damp handshakes, murmured condolences, and perfume that clung too sweetly to the already heavy air. I stood where Brittany had positioned me, near the framed photograph of Daniel in his navy button-down, smiling at something just beyond the camera, looking so alive that for a few cruel seconds my mind refused to accept the polished casket only yards away. People kept saying he had his father's eyes. They said he was one of the good ones. They said life was unfair. I nodded when politeness required it. But my attention drifted elsewhere, to the strange little movements around me that no grieving mother should have had the presence of mind to notice, yet somehow I noticed all of them. Brittany was not unraveling. She was managing. She floated from one guest to another with tissues in one hand and her phone in the other, touching elbows, lowering her voice at the right moments, pressing her lips together in a practiced show of restraint. More than once, I saw her glance toward Martin Hale at the back of the room, then quickly look away. Once, while an older couple from Daniel's office told me how dependable he had been during a difficult merger, Brittany slipped past us and whispered something to a man in a charcoal coat I did not recognize. He nodded, pulled a folded paper from his breast pocket, and handed it to her. She did not open it there. She tucked it into her purse and smoothed the clasp shut with the kind of calm that made my neck turn cold. Grief should make a person clumsy. It should make them forgetful. Brittany, on the other hand, seemed sharper by the minute. Chloe came to stand beside me after the service, her shoulders drawn tight under a black cardigan that looked borrowed. She was Daniel's daughter from his first marriage, 19 years old, and trying very hard to be braver than anyone had the right to ask. She slipped her hand into mine without a word. Her palm was ice cold. I squeezed it gently, and she leaned closer as if what she was about to say might bruise the air between us. "Grandma," she murmured, eyes fixed on the memory table. "Did Dad ever tell you about the folder?" I turned to look at her. For a second she seemed to regret speaking, but then she swallowed and kept going. "About a month ago he asked me where you kept extra house keys. I told him I did not know, and he said that was probably for the best. Then he laughed, but it did not sound like a joke." Before I could ask another question, Brittany appeared at Chloe's shoulder with a hand resting lightly, possessively, on the girl's back. "Sweetheart, the pastor wants to check on the luncheon timing," she said, though the pastor was nowhere near us. "Go help in the hall." Chloe stiffened, gave me one quick, uneasy glance, and obeyed. I watched Brittany watch her walk away. Then my daughter-in-law turned to me with that same polished expression she wore for strangers. "You must be exhausted, Margaret. After the meal, perhaps you should head home and rest. There is no need for you to worry about any of the arrangements." Any other day, those words might have sounded considerate. In that room, after everything, they sounded like a locked door. "I am not worried about arrangements," I said quietly. "I am here for my son." Something flickered across her face, gone almost at once. Annoyance, maybe, or surprise that I had answered at all. "Of course," she said. "That is what we all want." "We." The word stayed with me long after she stepped away to greet another guest. Because for the first time since Daniel died, I did not feel included in that little word. I felt managed by it, pressed outside it, reduced to a problem that had to be moved gently and quickly before it complicated the next step. When the crowd shifted toward the fellowship hall downstairs, I remained in the chapel for a moment under the excuse of gathering myself. The room had emptied enough for silence to return in soft waves. I looked at Daniel's photograph again, then at the spray of white roses laid across the casket lid, and memory came back to me with sudden, painful clarity. The last week in the hospital, the times I had been told he was asleep. The one afternoon I arrived with a change of clothes for him and found Brittany in the hallway arguing in a low, urgent voice with someone from administration. The way she stopped cold when she saw me and smiled too fast. At the time, I had been too frightened for Daniel to ask questions. Now the questions were all I had. I walked to the front, laid my fingertips against the polished wood for one brief moment, and made another promise, quieter than the first but stronger. I would go back through every odd glance, every delayed phone call, every missing detail. I would not accuse without proof, and I would not let grief make me careless. But whatever Daniel had tried to protect, whatever folder Chloe had mentioned, whatever Brittany thought she had already placed beyond my reach, I intended to find it. The luncheon downstairs felt less like a gathering of mourning and more like a room where everyone was waiting for something to be decided. Paper cups of coffee lined the counter beside trays of baked ziti and rolls no one seemed to taste. People lowered their voices when I passed, then raised them again once they thought I was out of earshot. I moved slowly through the fellowship hall with the careful posture grief gives the body, but inside I was paying attention in a way I had not allowed myself to during Daniel's illness. That was the strange thing about shock. At first it made the world go dim. Then, if you survived the first blow, it sharpened every edge. I found a seat near the window where weak February light fell across the folding tables, and from there I watched Brittany receive sympathy the way some people receive compliments, with a bowed head, a pause of exactly the right length, and then a soft thank you delivered as if each word had been polished. Every now and then, she would check her phone beneath the tablecloth. Once, she stepped aside to answer a call, and her voice, though hushed, changed completely. It lost its grief. It became brisk, clipped, practical. "Not today," she said. I said after the weekend. "I need numbers." First, when she noticed me looking in her direction, she turned her back and walked toward the kitchen. "Numbers." The word lodged in my chest like a pebble in a shoe. A few minutes later, Martin Hale crossed the room with a paper plate in one hand and asked whether he could sit beside me. Daniel had used him for business contracts years ago and later for his will after the divorce from Chloe's mother. Martin was in his early 50s, neat as ever, with silver at his temples and the kind of face that did not reveal much until it had to. He offered condolences first, gently and without performance, and then sat in silence long enough to make me trust him a little more. "Daniel cared deeply about keeping things in order," he said at last, even when he was not feeling his best. I looked at him carefully. "That sounds like a lawyer's way of saying there is something I do not know." Martin set down his fork. "It is my way of saying there may be conversations that should happen before anyone makes quick decisions." He did not glance toward Brittany, but he did not need to. I followed the line of his meaning easily enough. "About the house?" I asked. His expression barely shifted, yet something in it confirmed that I had stepped close to the truth. "About several matters," he said. "For now, I would advise you not to sign anything, not to surrender access to any property, and not to assume that what you are being told is the full picture." He said it quietly, but the words seemed to alter the temperature around me. I thought of Brittany telling me there was no need to worry about arrangements. I thought of Chloe whispering about a folder. I thought of the hospital hallway, the interrupted calls, the little frictions I had dismissed because I was too afraid of losing my son to question the woman standing nearest his bed. Across the room, Brittany laughed softly at something a cousin said, then caught Martin speaking with me and went still for half a second before recovering. That half second told me more than any confession could have. She knew there was a clock somewhere beneath all this morning, and she was listening for it. When Martin rose to leave, he slipped a business card onto the table beside my untouched coffee. "Call me before the end of the day tomorrow," he said. "And Margaret, whatever anyone tells you tonight, do not let grief rush you into gratitude." After he walked away, I sat with those words while the room buzzed around me in low voices and clinking cutlery. Gratitude. As if I were expected to be thankful for scraps of information, for limited access, for being tolerated in the aftermath of my own son's death. I lifted my coffee cup, though it had gone cold, and looked toward the kitchen doorway, where Brittany stood speaking to the man in the charcoal coat again. This time I saw her more clearly. Not as a widow overwhelmed by sorrow, but as a woman trying very hard to stay ahead of something. And for the first time since the funeral began, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. Daniel had known enough to prepare. Brittany knew enough to be nervous, which meant somewhere, hidden beneath all the flowers and casseroles and polite condolences, the truth was already waiting. When I finally left the funeral home, the rain had thinned to a cold mist that silvered the windshield and blurred the parking lot lights into pale halos. I sat behind the wheel for several minutes without starting the engine, Martin's card resting on the passenger seat beside my gloves, Chloe's frightened whisper still moving through my mind like a draft under a locked door. The drive back to my house took 22 minutes, the same route I had driven hundreds of times before, yet every familiar intersection looked altered, as if grief had shifted the scale of the town overnight. The grocery store where Daniel used to buy orange juice when he visited on Sundays. The pharmacy where I picked up his favorite throat lozenges when he had winter colds as a teenager. The gas station where he once called me from a pay phone after his first high school dance because he had forgotten his wallet and was too embarrassed to ask Brittany, who was only a classmate then, for help. Memory was cruel that way. It did not arrive in grand speeches. It arrived in parking lots, traffic lights, paper cups, the ordinary landmarks of a life that had once felt secure. By the time I pulled into my driveway, dusk had begun settling over the neighborhood in that quiet blue way February evenings have. My porch light was still on from the morning. Daniel had insisted years ago that I replace the old brass fixture with a brighter one because he said I should never come home to a dark entryway. I stood there for a moment with my key in my hand, looking at that steady square of warm light, and I had the sudden, piercing thought that even now he was still trying to take care of me in ways I had not fully understood. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and the lemon polish I had used on the dining table 2 days earlier. Everything was exactly where I had left it. The stack of sympathy cards on the counter, the untouched banana bread from a neighbor wrapped in foil, the Afghan folded over the arm of my chair. Grief had a strange habit of making rooms appear too still, as though furniture itself were holding its breath. I set my purse down, hung my coat carefully, and went straight to the kitchen sink to wash my hands. Not because they were dirty, but because I needed the small discipline of warm water, soap, and motion. When I looked up, my reflection in the window startled me. I seemed older than I had a week ago. Not weaker, just clearer. I made tea and carried it to the dining room, where Daniel's last birthday card still stood on the sideboard between 2 silver candlesticks. He had sent flowers with it, yellow roses and white snapdragons, and written in his neat slanted hand, "For the woman who made every hard season survivable." I remembered reading that line 3 times when it arrived, smiling at how sentimental he became only on paper. Daniel had always been careful with spoken tenderness. After his father died, he took on that quiet, watchful way some boys do when they decide too early that they must become dependable men. He was 12 when he first learned how to check the oil in my car. 15 when he started carrying groceries in without being asked. 27 when he told me, very seriously, that no matter how busy life became, I would never be an afterthought to him. That promise returned to me now with enough force to make my throat tighten, because somewhere between that son and the final week of his life, barriers had been placed around him so gradually that I had mistaken them for circumstance. I could admit that now. Brittany had not built a wall all at once. She had done it politely, brick by brick. She answered his phone more often. She began scheduling holiday meals around her family's convenience. She made small jokes about my being old-fashioned, always smiling as if she were teasing. If Daniel called less, she said work was brutal. If I offered help, she said they had everything under control. If I asked why plans kept changing, she would touch my arm and say, "Margaret, please do not take everything personally." And because I wanted peace for my son, because I did not want to become one more weight in his crowded life, I let too many things pass. I told myself modern marriages had different rhythms. I told myself being needed was not the same as being loved. I told myself patience was grace. Sitting there at my dining table with tea cooling untouched between my hands, I began to see those years differently, not as random disappointments, but as a pattern of careful narrowing. Less access, less information, less room. Until today, when she had finally said aloud what had likely been true in her mind for a long time. I rose, went to the hallway closet, and took down the old metal lockbox where I kept spare documents, insurance copies, and the house keys to the side entrance. Everything in it seemed undisturbed at first glance. Then I noticed one key was missing. Daniel had asked about spare keys, Chloe had said. At the time, I had assumed she meant idle curiosity. Now the absence felt deliberate. I closed the box slowly and stood very still. Somewhere in this house, or somewhere connected to it, my son had tried to leave me a path. And now that I had begun to understand how carefully the ground had been shifting beneath my feet, I was done pretending I had simply lost my balance. The house was quiet enough that I could hear the old clock in the hallway marking each second like a warning. I set the lockbox on the dining table beneath the hanging light and went through it again, slower this time, laying everything out with the patience age teaches when emotion would only blur the obvious. Insurance documents, tax records, the deed to my house, a worn envelope that still held Daniel's college graduation program because I had once tucked it away there for safekeeping and forgotten to move it. No note, no folder, no explanation, only that missing spare key and the uneasy certainty that it mattered. I was reaching for my phone to call Martin when it began to ring in my hand. Chloe's name flashed across the screen. Her voice, when I answered, was low and breathless, as though she were speaking from a bathroom or a parked car. "Grandma, I cannot stay on long," she said. "She is still with people." I knew without asking who she meant. I sat down slowly. "Tell me what you know." There was a pause, the rustle of fabric. Then Chloe let out a shaky breath. "Dad came by my apartment 3 weeks ago. It was late, almost 10. He looked tired, really tired, but also kind of wired, like he had too much on his mind. He asked if I still had the old cedar chest from when I moved out of the dorms. I told him yes. He said if anything ever happened and things got confusing, I should remember that cedar keeps paper dry." I closed my eyes for 1 second. In the attic, beneath the guest room, there was an old cedar chest that had belonged to my mother. I had stored quilts in it for years. Last Christmas, Daniel had carried it down for me, saying it was too heavy for me to lift alone. At the time, it had seemed like an ordinary kindness. Now it glowed in memory like a signal. "Why did you not tell me this sooner?" I asked gently. Chloe sounded close to tears. "Because I thought he was being dramatic. Then everything happened so fast. And Brittany kept saying not to upset you, not to fill your head with legal stuff, not to make this harder." The phrase was so familiar it made my mouth go dry. Brittany had been curating the entire atmosphere around Daniel's death, deciding what counted as helpful, what counted as unnecessary, what counted as mine to know. "There is more," Chloe whispered. "At the hospital, 2 days before he passed, I heard them arguing. Not yelling. Dad was too weak to yell. But I heard him say, 'You are not locking my mother out.' And Brittany said, 'I am trying to be realistic, Daniel. I am not signing up to manage your whole family forever.'" I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles ached. The cruelty of the funeral whisper had not been spontaneous after all. It had roots. It had a history. It had been rehearsed in private before it was ever spoken in public. "Did anyone else hear?" I asked. "A nurse walked in right after that," Chloe said. And Brittany came out acting like she had just been crying. "Grandma, I do not think Dad trusted her at the end. I think he was trying to fix something before he ran out of time." After we hung up, I remained still for a long moment, listening to the silence settle again around the kitchen and dining room. Then I rose, took the attic pull-down ladder from the hall closet, and carried it beneath the ceiling hatch outside the guest room. The muscles in my shoulders protested as I tugged the cord and brought the ladder down inch by inch. Dust floated in the yellow light above like pale ash. I climbed carefully, one rung at a time, my sensible black dress from the funeral catching slightly at the knee. The attic smelled of cedar, old cardboard, and insulation, a smell so bound up with storage and seasons and family overflow that for a brief second I felt as though I had stepped into another decade. There, against the far wall under the eaves, sat my mother's cedar chest with the brass handles Daniel had polished for me when he was 16. A folded Afghan lay on top of it exactly where I had left it after Christmas. No one looking quickly would have thought anything had changed. I crossed the floorboards and touched the lid with both hands. My heartbeat had become unnaturally steady, each pulse calm and deliberate, as if some part of me already knew what waited inside. Daniel had not been careless. He had not been weak. He had been trying, in whatever time and strength he had left, to leave behind a map. And standing there in the dim attic above the life I had thought was still mine, I understood that the next thing I found might tell me exactly why Brittany had already begun speaking. As though I belonged to the past, I lifted the lid slowly, expecting the familiar weight of folded quilts and winter blankets. But what I found first was a large manila envelope placed neatly on top, as if Daniel had wanted it to be the first thing my hands touched. My name was written across the front in his slanted handwriting, the same handwriting from the birthday card still standing downstairs on the sideboard. For a moment I could not move. I just stood there in the dim attic light with one hand on the cedar lid and the other resting against the envelope, feeling the rough paper beneath my fingertips and the full quiet of the house pressing up around me. Then I took it out, sat carefully on an old storage trunk nearby, and opened it. Inside were copies of documents, a set of printed emails, one small key taped to an index card, and a letter folded twice. I read the letter first. "Mom," it began, plain and direct, which was always Daniel's way when something mattered. He wrote that if I was reading it, then things had likely become more complicated than he had hoped. He said he had been trying to get stronger and sort everything himself, but he no longer trusted time to give him that chance. He apologized for not telling me sooner that he and Brittany had been arguing for months about money, the house, and what she kept calling practical arrangements in the event his health did not improve. He wrote that he had told her more than once that I was never to be pressured, displaced, or handled like an obligation. The words were so unmistakably his that I could hear his voice in every line, restrained, careful, still trying to protect everyone's dignity even while his own strength was slipping away. By the time I reached the bottom of the second page, my eyes burned, but I did not cry. Not then. Some grief arrives as tears. Some arrives as stillness, so deep it feels like stone. The documents beneath the letter told the rest of the story in colder language. Daniel had created a trust 3 months earlier. Martin Hale was listed as trustee. There were clear instructions that a portion of Daniel's life insurance was to provide for Chloe's education and that a separate protected amount was to be set aside for my housing, medical costs, and personal care if needed. There was also a clause, written with a precision only lawyers seem able to summon, stating that any attempt by a beneficiary or spouse to coerce, isolate, or unlawfully remove me from property designated for my use would trigger an immediate review and possible suspension of discretionary distributions. I read that paragraph twice. Then a third time. Daniel had not merely worried. He had anticipated. He had seen enough to build safeguards. Taped to the index card was the small key Chloe had unknowingly pointed me toward. Beneath it, Daniel had written, Safe Deposit Box. First Federal on Maple. Martin knows. My breathing turned shallow for a moment as the pattern sharpened into something undeniable. The missing spare key in my lockbox. The hospital argument. Brittany's fixation on arrangements. Martin's warning not to sign anything. This was not the fog of misunderstandings after a sudden loss. This was a woman trying to move quickly before the framework Daniel had built came fully into view. I went through the printed emails next. Most were between Daniel and Martin, discussing revisions, access, and a private inventory. But one chain included Brittany. In it she pressed Daniel to consolidate accounts, simplify property access, and avoid what she called long-term burdens that will fall unfairly on me. Daniel's reply was brief and devastating in its clarity. My mother is not a burden. She is my mother. I stared at that line until the page blurred. Then I set every document back into the envelope with careful, steady hands. My pulse no longer raced. It had settled into something cleaner than panic and colder than sorrow. I rose from the trunk, lowered the cedar lid, and stood in the attic listening to the soft creak of the old house beneath me. Brittany had believed grief would make me passive. She had mistaken heartbreak for helplessness. But Daniel had done what loving sons do when words are no longer enough. He had left me facts. And facts, unlike sympathy, do not vanish when the guests go home. The rest of that night passed in a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if the house itself understood that something had changed and was waiting to see what I would do with it. I carried the envelope downstairs, locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk, and sat in the living room with only the lamp by the sofa turned on. Rain tapped softly at the windows. Somewhere down the block, a car door shut and an engine started, then faded away. Ordinary sounds. A neighborhood settling into evening. Yet nothing inside me felt ordinary anymore. I read Daniel's letter again just before midnight, slower this time, tracing the shape of each sentence as though the pressure of his pen might still hold some warmth. He had written with care, but underneath the careful words I could feel urgency. He had known Brittany would move quickly. He had known she would wrap self-interest in language that sounded efficient and reasonable. He had known that once grief entered the room, people would expect me to become smaller inside it. That was what hurt most, perhaps. Not only that my son had been forced to prepare for his own absence, but that he had been forced to prepare for the behavior of the woman standing closest to him. I slept only a few hours and woke before sunrise to a house washed pale blue by the first light. I dressed in a navy sweater and gray slacks, tied my hair back, and made coffee strong enough to steady my hands. At 8:15, precisely as I was pouring the second cup, my phone rang. Brittany. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice arrived thin with practiced strain. She asked how I was holding up, whether I had managed to rest, whether I remembered to eat something. I listened without interrupting. Then she moved to the point so smoothly that anyone less alert might have mistaken it for concern. She said there were a few practical matters to address. Insurance forms, access to Daniel's office, a review of property-related expenses. She said the house on Willow Crest would be too much for one person now, and that she was trying to avoid confusion later. Confusion. Another polished word. I stared out the kitchen window at the bare dogwood tree near my porch and said, I do not intend to make any decisions this week. There was the briefest pause. Of course, she replied, though irritation sharpened the edges of her voice. I only thought it would help to keep things organized. Organized for whom? I wondered. Aloud I said nothing. She then suggested coming by that afternoon with a folder of documents for me to look over. That sentence told me more than she realized. She already had papers prepared. She had not spent the night mourning. She had spent it assembling leverage. Today will not work, I said. I have my own errands. Her tone cooled by a degree. Margaret, some of these things are time sensitive. I took a sip of coffee before answering, not because I needed it, but because calm can sound like power when used correctly. Then they can be discussed with Martin present. This time the silence on the line lasted long enough to become its own kind of confession. When Brittany spoke again, she sounded almost offended. Why would we need Martin? I am only trying to make this easier on everyone. Everyone. That word again. So neat. So useful. So empty. I am sure you are, I said, and ended the call before she could reshape the conversation. I set the phone down and stood very still in the brightening kitchen, feeling not triumph, but confirmation. She was nervous. Nervous enough to push. Nervous enough to risk sounding impatient less than 24 hours after the funeral. At 9:30, I met Martin Hale at his office downtown, a narrow brick building above a pharmacy that still used painted gold lettering on the window. He had already reviewed the trust paperwork and the copies from Daniel's envelope by the time I arrived. His secretary brought tea, closed the door, and left us in a room lined with shelves and framed certificates. Martin folded his hands and said, I had hoped Daniel's concerns would prove unnecessary. I reached into my handbag, placed the printed email on the desk, and turned it so he could read the line Daniel had sent Brittany. My mother is not a burden. Martin's expression changed only slightly, but it was enough. Then you understand? I said. He nodded. I do. And based on this, as well as the language Daniel insisted be added, I think your daughter-in-law understands more than she wants you to realize. He told me the safe deposit box likely held original instructions and a property inventory Daniel had referenced in earlier meetings. He also told me, with legal caution and unmistakable seriousness, that until the box was opened and all directives reviewed, I should sign nothing, surrender nothing, and agree to no change in residence, access, or authority. Then he slid a yellow legal pad toward me and began listing steps in clean, measured handwriting. Call the bank. Document every conversation. Save every message. Do not meet Brittany alone if paperwork is involved. There was nothing dramatic in his tone, and that was exactly what made it powerful. By the time I left his office, the morning had sharpened into a cold, bright day with sunlight glaring off windshields and frost still clinging to shaded lawns. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment with Daniel's key in my coat pocket and Martin's notes in my bag, and I felt the pieces settle into place. Brittany had already begun her move. But now, for the first time since I heard that whisper by the casket, I was no longer reacting inside her version of events. I was stepping into my son's. First Federal sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd in a low brick building with brass handles polished so often they caught the morning light like gold. I had passed it for years without really seeing it, the way people stop noticing places that have always been there. That day I noticed everything. The flags snapping in the wind above the entrance. The narrow strip of ice still clinging to the curb in the shade. The dull reflection of my own face in the glass door as I reached for the handle. Martin met me inside near the teller line, overcoat still on, leather briefcase in hand. He did not waste words. He simply nodded once and said, "We should do this now, before anyone has the chance to complicate it." There was something quietly reassuring in the way he said it. Not dramatic, not alarmed, just certain. We were escorted into a private room by the branch manager, a woman in her 60s named Elaine who spoke softly and moved with the careful professionalism of someone who had seen families at their best and worst around money. She confirmed my identification, reviewed the paperwork Martin had already prepared, and then brought out a slim metal box no larger than a bread loaf. Daniel's handwriting appeared again on the access card attached to the file. That sight alone nearly undid me. He had known, even in the middle of his illness, that there might come a day when I would sit in a bank under fluorescent lights, opening the remains of his final precautions. Elaine left us alone. For a moment neither Martin nor I touched the box. Then I used the small key Daniel had taped to the index card and heard the lock give with a clean little click that seemed far louder than it should have. Inside were 3 items arranged with painful neatness. An original copy of the trust amendment, a sealed envelope marked "for my mother," if needed, and a small flash drive taped to a handwritten inventory sheet. I opened the envelope first. Daniel wrote that he was placing additional records in the box because he feared documents left at home might disappear or be reinterpreted. He said that sentence with such restrained politeness that I knew he had struggled to write it. He never liked speaking badly of anyone, even when he had reason. Beneath the letter was a typed inventory listing account summaries, property notes, and one line that made the room seem to tilt for a moment beneath me. Willowcrest House, partial transfer delayed, pending review of spouse conduct and occupancy protections for Margaret Whitmore. I looked up at Martin. Delayed? I asked. He adjusted his glasses and read the line again. Daniel revised this less than 2 weeks ago, he said. He changed the timing of the transfer and connected it to the conduct provisions. He turned the page, meaning Brittany was not supposed to receive unrestricted control if there were concerns about how she handled access, housing, or coercion. I thought of her phone call that morning, the folder of documents she wanted to bring, the urgency she had tried to dress up as efficiency. She had been reaching for authority she did not yet fully have. Worse, she had likely guessed there was a barrier somewhere and hoped to move before I found it. Martin inserted the flash drive into his laptop. The folder on it contained scanned emails, voice memos, and one video file recorded from Daniel's home office. The video was only 3 minutes long. Daniel sat at his desk in a blue sweater, pale and visibly tired, but steady. He looked directly into the camera in that serious way he had when he wanted no room for misunderstanding. He said that if anything happened to him, I was not to be pressured into leaving my home, signing away rights, or relying solely on Brittany for information. He said Chloe was to be protected. He said Martin had full authority to review any conduct that suggested manipulation or financial pressure. Then he paused, looked down briefly as if gathering strength, and added, My mother spent her life making sure I never felt like a burden. I will not allow her to be treated as one now. I did not realize I had covered my mouth with my hand until the video ended and the screen went dark. Martin gave me a moment before speaking. With this, he said quietly, any attempt to force speed, secrecy, or removal becomes a very serious mistake on her part. Serious mistake. That was the kind of phrase lawyers used when the truth was strong enough to speak for itself. I folded Daniel's letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. My grief was still there, enormous and unchangeable, but it no longer left me directionless. It had been given shape by evidence, by intention, by my son's unmistakable voice. When we left the bank, the afternoon air felt sharper than before, clean and cold in my lungs. As I stood on the sidewalk with the envelope tucked safely inside my handbag, my phone buzzed again. Brittany. This time I let it ring until it stopped. A minute later, a text appeared. We need to settle things before rumors start and people get confused. I read it once and slipped the phone back into my coat pocket. Confused was not the word for what she feared. Exposed was closer. And for the first time since Daniel died, I knew exactly where the next conversation needed to happen and who needed to hear it. Martin arranged the meeting for the following afternoon in the conference room at his office, not because legal formality was required yet, but because some truths need walls, witnesses, and a table sturdy enough to hold the weight of them. Brittany arrived 10 minutes early in a camel coat with oversized sunglasses and a leather folder tucked under one arm, composed in the brittle way people become when they have rehearsed a version of reality and expect everyone else to follow along. Chloe came with me, quiet but steady, and sat at my left. Martin sat across from us with a yellow legal pad, a copy of the trust amendment, and Daniel's printed letter laid in precise stacks before him. The room itself was plain, almost disappointingly ordinary, with beige walls, a framed watercolor of the courthouse, and a tray of untouched bottled water at the end of the table. I was grateful for that plainness. It kept the moment from turning theatrical. Brittany opened with sympathy, then efficiency. She said she wanted to avoid unnecessary tension. She said Daniel would have wanted all of us to stay practical and united. She said there were property matters that needed immediate attention and suggested that, for everyone's peace of mind, I should consider moving somewhere smaller, perhaps a senior community with amenities, while she sorted out the estate and made decisions about Willow Crest. She spoke gently, almost kindly, as if this were an act of generosity instead of removal. When she finished, Martin did not respond at once. He simply slid one page across the table and said, "Before any discussion continues, I think we should review Mr. Whitmore's binding instructions." Brittany's fingers tightened around her pen. "I already know what Daniel wanted," she said. "I was his wife." Martin's tone remained even. "You know some of what he wanted." "Not all." Then he began to read. He read the clause regarding housing protection and occupancy rights for Margaret Whitmore. He read the provision concerning coercion, isolation, or attempts to pressure me into surrendering access or authority. He read the section that allowed review and suspension of discretionary distributions if a beneficiary's conduct raised concerns. With each paragraph, the color in Brittany's face changed by degrees, not dramatically, but enough for any honest person in the room to see. She interrupted twice. First to say this was being taken out of context, then to insist Daniel only added those conditions because he was sick and anxious. Martin did not argue. He only opened his laptop, turned the screen toward her, and played the video from the safe deposit box. Daniel appeared in that blue sweater, pale and tired, but unmistakably clear. His voice filled the room with a steadiness I had not realized I needed until I heard it again. He said I was not to be pressured into leaving my home. He said Chloe was to be protected. He said information was not to be controlled through one person. And then he said the line that split whatever polished defense Brittany had brought with her. "My mother spent her life making sure I never felt like a burden. I will not allow her to be treated as one now." When the video ended, silence settled over the room so fully that even the hum of the heating vent sounded loud. Brittany stared at the black screen for a long moment before saying, very quietly, "He did not understand how much responsibility this would put on me." It was not grief speaking. It was resentment stripped of decoration. Chloe turned toward her then, eyes bright and unblinking, and said, "He understood exactly." No one raised a voice. No one needed to. Martin folded his hands and explained, in the same calm tone he had used from the beginning, that there would be no immediate property transfer, no unilateral decision-making, and no discussions about my relocation without legal review. He also advised that all future communication regarding the estate, housing, and trust matters should go through his office. Brittany looked at me then, not with sorrow, but with the cold disbelief of someone discovering the person they dismissed as weak had arrived with proof. I held her gaze and said the only thing I had planned to say from the moment I heard that whisper beside my son's casket. "You do not get to erase me from my own family." She opened her mouth as if to answer, then closed it again. There are moments when defeat does not look dramatic. It looks like a person realizing the room no longer bends around them. Brittany gathered her folder, stood, and left without another word. After the door shut, I remained seated for a few seconds with Daniel's voice still echoing in my mind, and I felt the grief return in its full size, but not in the same shape. It was still heavy. It would always be heavy, but it no longer came with confusion. My son had not left me helpless. He had left me seen. When I stepped out of Martin's office into the cold late afternoon, Chloe slipped her arm through mine, and together we walked to the sidewalk under a sky the color of brushed steel. I did not feel victorious. Loss does not turn into victory, but I did feel something quieter and, in its own way, stronger. I felt restored to my rightful place. Daniel was gone. Nothing would undo that. Yet the woman who had spoken about me as if I were an inconvenience to be managed had learned what my son already knew. I was not a burden to be moved aside. I was his mother, and I was still standing.